February 1945, somewhere in the verdant hills of Leyte, Philippines. The monsoon rains had ceased 3 days prior, leaving the earth soft and fragrant with the scent of wet soil and crushed vegetation. Inside a makeshift detention compound surrounded by hastily erected chain-link fencing, 37 Japanese women sat in ordered rows beneath canvas tarps that fluttered in the tropical breeze. They were nurses, comfort station workers, and civilian administrators who had been swept up in the American advance through the Philippine archipelago. Their uniforms, once crisp and purposeful, now hung loose on frames diminished by months of inadequate rations and the grinding anxiety of a collapsing empire. Through the fence, they could see them. American soldiers, young men who moved with a casual confidence that seemed almost alien to women raised in a culture where every gesture carried the weight of hierarchical precision. These soldiers were not merely different in nationality or language. They represented something that existed beyond the carefully constructed ideology that had shaped every aspect of these women's consciousness since childhood. The Americans played volleyball in the compound yard during their rest periods, their bodies moving with an unself-conscious vitality that would have been considered improper, even scandalous, in the regimented society from which these women had come. One soldier in particular caught the attention of many. He was perhaps 23, with sun-darkened skin stretched over muscles that rippled with each movement as he leaped for the ball, his laughter carrying across the humid air like something foreign and inexplicably compelling. His name was irrelevant to the women watching. What mattered was what he represented, a physical manifestation of a world they had been taught to hate, yet could not help but regard with a confusion of emotions they had no framework to understand. This was not supposed to happen. In the careful architecture of wartime propaganda, the enemy was supposed to remain monstrous, subhuman, unworthy of anything resembling admiration or curiosity. But ideology, however deeply instilled, cannot entirely suppress the fundamental human capacity for observation, for reassessment, for the slow erosion of certainty when confronted with evidence that contradicts everything one has been taught to believe. The story of what happened in those detention camps scattered across the Pacific theater in the final months and aftermath of World War II is not one that fits comfortably into the official narratives of either victor or vanquished. It is a story of psychological dissonance, of women who found themselves suspended between the collapsing mythology of Japanese supremacy and the undeniable reality of American abundance, between the austere militarism that had defined their world and the casual democracy of young men who seemed utterly unaware of their own power to subvert decades of carefully constructed belief. To understand the profound nature of this transformation, one must first understand what these women had been taught, what they believed with the certainty of religious conviction, and how completely that worldview would be shattered by the simple, overwhelming fact of physical presence. In the Japanese Empire of the 1930s and early 1940s, the concept of racial and cultural superiority was not merely political doctrine. It was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Children learned from their earliest school days that Japan was the land of the gods, that the Japanese people were descended from divine lineage, that their mission was to bring order and civilization to the inferior races of Asia and beyond. This was not presented as opinion, but as biological and spiritual fact, as immutable as the laws of physics. The West, and particularly America, occupied a specific place in this mythology. Americans were portrayed as soft, decadent, obsessed with material comfort at the expense of spiritual purity and martial virtue. They were depicted in propaganda films and educational materials as physically weak, their bodies corrupted by excess and their spirits polluted by individualism and the worship of money. Japanese military training emphasized the superiority of the Japanese soldier, lean, disciplined, willing to die for the emperor without hesitation. The American soldier, by contrast, was presented as a coward who would flee at the first sign of real hardship, who fought only because he was paid to do so, who lacked the spiritual fortitude that came from centuries of samurai tradition and Shinto devotion. For women, the indoctrination was even more comprehensive. Japanese women were taught that their role was to serve their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons, and above all to serve the emperor and the state. Personal desire was not merely discouraged, it was presented as fundamentally incompatible with proper femininity. A good Japanese woman did not question, did not assert her own preferences, and certainly did not allow her gaze to linger on male bodies with anything resembling desire or admiration. Such thoughts were evidence of moral corruption, of Western contamination, of a failure to embody the virtues of Yamato Neitshiko, the idealized Japanese woman, beautiful and compliant as a flower yet possessing inner steel in service to duty. The nurses and workers who found themselves in American detention compounds had been thoroughly shaped by this ideology. Many had volunteered for service in the occupied territories, believing they were participating in a sacred mission to extend Japanese civilization to benighted peoples. They had watched Japanese soldiers prepare for battle with ritual solemnity, had seen men half-starved yet maintaining perfect discipline, had absorbed the constant message that spiritual strength could overcome any material disadvantage. They had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that when the Americans came, they should expect brutality, rape, torture, the natural behavior of a racially inferior people without honor or self-control. When the American forces finally overran Japanese positions across the Pacific, these women prepared themselves for martyrdom. Some carried poison. Many wrote farewell letters to families they expected never to see again. They had been instructed that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that they would be defiled by subhuman monsters, that their suffering would serve as testament to Japanese virtue in the face of barbarism. And then the Americans arrived, and nothing was as it was supposed to be. The first shock was the food. In February 1945, the average Japanese soldier or civilian in the occupied territories was subsisting on perhaps 1,200 calories per day, often less. Rice rations had been cut repeatedly as supply lines collapsed under American air and naval superiority. Soldiers were expected to live off the land, a euphemism for systematic starvation punctuated by occasional foraging. The women who had served in field hospitals and administrative posts had watched young men waste away, their bodies consuming themselves, their eyes growing hollow with the peculiar madness that accompanies prolonged malnutrition. When these women were processed into American custody, they were given food, not minimal sustenance but actual meals. The K-rations that represented field rations for American troops contained more calories than Japanese soldiers had seen in months. Canned meat, actual meat, not the occasional fish head or scrap of gristle, chocolate, fruit cocktail and heavy syrup, coffee with cream and sugar. The abundance was incomprehensible, almost offensive in its casual extravagance. One woman, a nurse named Akiko who had served in a field hospital near Leyte, later recounted in a deposition taken by Allied war crimes investigators that she wept the first time she was given an American meal. Not from gratitude, the concept seemed absurd, but from a kind of existential confusion. She had been taught that America was a nation exhausting itself in decadent consumption, that the war would be won by Japanese spiritual superiority over American material weakness. Yet here was evidence that America could feed its soldiers so well that prisoners of war received more food than Japanese troops in the field. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. But more disturbing than the food itself was what it represented. The American soldiers who distributed these rations did so with a casual friendliness that seemed utterly incompatible with what these women had been taught to expect. They smiled. They made jokes, incomprehensible in English but clearly jokes, eliciting laughter from their comrades. They treated the distribution of food not as a strategic necessity or a propaganda opportunity. but as a routine administrative task, something to be completed before they return to their volleyball games or their letters home or their easy camaraderie. The women watched them, initially with the wariness of prey animals, expecting the inevitable moment when the mask would slip and the promised brutality would emerge. But days passed, then weeks, and that moment never came. Instead, what they observed were young men who seemed remarkably, almost incomprehensibly, unburdened by the weight of military discipline as they understood it. These soldiers moved with loose-limbed ease. They laughed frequently and loudly. They argued with their officers in ways that would have been unthinkable in the Japanese military. And their bodies were something that challenged everything these women had been taught about racial superiority and military virtue. The volleyball games became a focal point of attention not through any deliberate decision, but through the simple fact of proximity and the human tendency to observe what is immediately present. The American soldiers played frequently during their off-duty hours, and the detention compound was positioned such that the women could see clearly through the fence. Initially, the women averted their eyes, as propriety demanded. But propriety is a fragile thing when confronted with persistent reality, and gradually, furtively at first, they began to watch. What they saw challenged not merely their propaganda-fed expectations of American physical weakness, but their entire understanding of the relationship between body, spirit, and military virtue. The Japanese military ideal emphasized spiritual strength achieved through privation and absolute discipline. The body was a tool to be trained certainly, but ultimately subordinate to will. Japanese soldiers were taught to ignore hunger, cold, pain. The body's complaints were evidence of insufficient spiritual development. The result, especially in the final years of the war, was an army of men whose bodies had been worn to sinew and bone, whose physical deterioration was framed as evidence of their superior dedication to duty. The American soldiers playing volleyball bore no resemblance to this ideal. They were, by Japanese standards, almost shockingly well-nourished. Their muscles were not the lean, stringy tissue of men barely surviving, but the full, rounded musculature of youth sustained by adequate protein and calories. Their skin glowed with health. Their movements were explosive, energetic, wasteful in their expenditure of energy in a way that spoke to deep reserves of strength. They played not with grim determination but with obvious enjoyment, their athleticism not a demonstration of discipline, but an expression of vitality so abundant it sought release in purposeless recreation. One soldier in particular became, in the whispered conversations among the women, a kind of symbol, though they did not have the language or the framework to articulate what he symbolized. He was tall by Japanese standards, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by some combination of genetics and the endless calisthenics that were part of American military training. When he jumped for the volleyball, his body formed a perfect arc of coordinated muscle, his abdominal muscles visible through his sweat-dampened t-shirt, his arms extending with a power that sent the ball rocketing across the makeshift court. The Japanese word utsukushii, beautiful, was never spoken in reference to these soldiers, at least not aloud. Beauty in male bodies was not something Japanese women of this era were encouraged to contemplate, certainly not the beauty of enemy bodies. Yet something was being recognized, something that had no proper name in the ideological framework these women had inhabited. They had been taught to see American soldiers as weak, soft, corrupted by comfort. The evidence before their eyes suggested something entirely different. These were not the bodies of men weakened by decadence. These were the bodies of men sustained by a system so abundant, so rich in resources, that its soldiers could be fed and trained to peak physical condition while simultaneously conducting a war across 2 oceans and multiple continents. The implications were staggering, and, for many of these women, impossible to fully process in real time. If the propaganda had been wrong about this, about something as observable and undeniable as the physical condition of American soldiers, what else had been wrong? If America was not exhausting itself in decadent weakness, if it could field armies of well-fed, healthy, powerful young men while simultaneously supplying allies and maintaining civilian prosperity, then what did that mean about the war? About Japan's chances? About the ideology that had shaped every aspect of their understanding of the world? The records from the immediate post-war period are fragmentary but revealing. Allied intelligence services conducted thousands of interviews with Japanese prisoners of war and civilian detainees, primarily seeking information about military installations, troop movements, and potential war crimes. But scattered through these official documents are observations about the psychological state of detainees, particularly women, that hint at the profound disorientation experienced by those whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by daily experience. A report dated April 1945 from a detention facility in Guam notes that Japanese female detainees were unexpectedly cooperative and showed signs of ideological confusion. The interviewing officer, a Captain Richard Morrison from military intelligence, observed that many women seemed eager to discuss their surprise at treatment by American personnel, and that several had commented, through interpreters, on the physical health and good treatment of American soldiers. Morrison, writing in the dry language of military intelligence, seems to have missed the deeper significance of these observations, categorizing them primarily as evidence of effective American psychological operations. But a more perceptive analysis comes from a Red Cross worker, Margaret Sutherland, who spent 6 months working in detention facilities across the Philippines. In her private diary, excerpts of which were later published in a small circulation memoir in 1952, she records a conversation with a Japanese nurse named Fumiko. She asked me, through the interpreter, if American men always looked so healthy. I told her that most young American men, particularly those who had been in the service, were quite fit. She seemed troubled by this and said something to the interpreter that he was reluctant to translate. When I pressed him, he said that she had remarked that Japanese propaganda had told them American soldiers would be weak and afraid. She said the soldiers she had seen were neither weak nor afraid, and that this had caused her to question what else she had been told that was untrue. I found this quite moving. The whole architecture of her understanding seemed to be crumbling, and she was both frightened and, I think, oddly fascinated by the possibility of a world different from the one she had been taught to believe in. This fascination, this reluctant but irresistible attraction to a worldview being revealed through the simple fact of physical presence, was not unique to Fumiko. It appears again and again in the fragmentary records, in the observations of guards and administrators, in the few personal testimonies that emerged decades later, when some of these women felt able to speak about experiences that had been shameful or confusing or simply impossible to articulate within the contexts available to them. The attraction was not, or not simply, sexual, though the sexual dimension cannot be dismissed. These were young women, many in their early 20s, who had been taught to suppress any acknowledgement of their own desires, to view their bodies and the bodies of men purely through the lens of duty and social function. But human psychology does not work so neatly. The sudden, sustained exposure to male bodies in peak physical condition, moving with unself-conscious vitality, could not help but provoke responses that had been carefully trained out of conscious awareness, but could not be entirely erased. More fundamentally, what these women were experiencing was a form of ideological vertigo. They had been raised in a system of absolute certainties where every aspect of life was structured by clear hierarchies and unquestionable truths. The emperor was divine. Japan was superior. The West was decadent and weak. Women existed to serve. Personal desire was subordinate to duty. These were not opinions. They were the very structure of reality itself. And then, in the space of days or weeks, that structure revealed itself to be fiction. Not gradually, not through reasoned argument, but through the undeniable evidence of their own senses. The Americans were not weak. They were not cruel in the ways that had been promised. They possessed resources so abundant that they seemed almost casual about them. They fed prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers. They built detention facilities with running water and medical care. They played volleyball with the easy confidence of men who had never doubted their own strength or their nation's ability to sustain them. Symbolic power of abundance, particularly food, in reshaping perception cannot be overstated. Throughout the war, Japanese military and civilian populations had been sustained by the ideology of sacrifice, the belief that privation itself was virtuous, evidence of spiritual strength and national character. To endure hunger was to demonstrate one's worthiness as a subject of the emperor. The propaganda was explicit. Americans fought for money and comfort. Japanese fought for honor and glory. The material superiority of the enemy was acknowledged, but framed as moral weakness. They needed tanks and planes and ships because they lacked the spiritual strength to prevail through will alone. This ideology sustained morale through extraordinary hardship. Japanese soldiers fought with ferocious determination despite being outgunned and outnumbered. Civilians accepted severe rationing without widespread unrest. The mythology of spiritual superiority over material advantage was powerful precisely because it offered meaning to suffering, transformed deprivation into virtue, made starvation itself a kind of triumph over the corrupting influence of material desire. But this ideology required that American abundance be paired with American weakness. The Americans had more because they needed more. They were spiritually soft, dependent on material support, unable to match Japanese determination. When Japanese women in detention facilities observed American soldiers who were both materially abundant and physically powerful, the entire ideological framework collapsed into incoherence. These were not weak men made comfortable by excess. These were strong men whose strength was enabled and enhanced by abundance. The food itself became a recurring symbol in the fragmented testimonies that survive. Almost every account mentions it: the overwhelming quantity, the variety, the quality. One woman described receiving a chocolate bar and staring at it for nearly an hour, unable to reconcile the existence of food given away as a casual treat with her understanding of a world where rice rations had been cut 5 times in the past year. Another described watching American soldiers complain about their K-rations, actually complaining about food that seemed to her like luxury, and feeling a kind of despairing laughter at the vast gulf between their expectations and hers. But more than the food itself, it was the bodies built by that abundance that had lasting psychological impact. The volleyball games, the casual displays of athleticism, the unself-conscious physicality of young men who had never known real hunger, these became the focus of obsessive, guilty attention. The women watched not merely with curiosity, but with something approaching need, a desperate attempt to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed they knew about the world. In the Japanese language, there is a word, mono no aware, that speaks to a sensitivity to ephemera, a gentle sadness at the transience of things. But for these women, what they were experiencing was something different, something for which their language and culture had not prepared them. They were watching the dissolution of permanence itself, the revelation that what they had believed eternal and absolute was, in fact, contingent and false. The sadness was not gentle but vertiginous, a sense of freefall without knowing where or how they might land. As the weeks passed and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the dynamics within the detention facilities began to shift in subtle ways. The initial wariness on both sides, the women expecting brutality, the American guards maintaining professional distance, gradually softened. This was not a matter of policy but of human nature asserting itself despite ideology and circumstance. Guards learned names, made small jokes through interpreters, shared cigarettes and sweets. The women, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, began to ask questions. The questions were revealing in what they assumed and what they struggled to understand. One woman asked a guard, through an interpreter, whether Americans ever felt shame about their bodies, whether their culture encouraged physical modesty. The guard, a young corporal from Iowa named James Whitfield, was baffled by the question and responded that Americans wore bathing suits at public beaches, that there was nothing shameful about a healthy body. This response, when translated, provoked an animated discussion among the women that the interpreter struggled to convey. Something about the relationship between physical display and moral virtue, about whether strength could coexist with immodesty, about whether their own cultural emphasis on concealment and restraint had perhaps made them weak rather than virtuous. Another woman asked why American soldiers were permitted to play games during wartime, whether this was not a distraction from duty. The response, that recreation was considered essential for morale and combat effectiveness, seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between discipline and military success. In the Japanese military, recreation was virtually non-existent. The concept that soldiers performed better when given time for purposeless play seemed almost obscene in its indulgence. These conversations, awkward and fragmentary as they were, represent a kind of ideological negotiation, an attempt by women raised in one system of meaning to find purchase in another. The American soldiers, for their part, were mostly oblivious to the deeper significance of these exchanges. They were young men doing a job, treating prisoners with basic human decency, because that was what they had been instructed to do, and what accorded with their own cultural values. They did not realize that their casual kindness, their unconscious displays of physical vitality, their easy confidence, were acting as a kind of solvent on worldviews constructed over decades of careful indoctrination. The volleyball games continued and the women continued to watch, but the nature of that watching evolved. The initial shock had passed, and what remained was something more complex, a kind of reluctant admiration, a growing sense that these men represented not merely a different nation but a different possibility for human existence. They were not brutish despite their strength. They were not crude despite their physical confidence. They laughed easily but fought effectively. They were well-fed but not soft. Every observable fact about them contradicted the mythology that had structured these women's understanding of the world. And gradually, in whispered conversations conducted in the humid evenings after the day's routines had concluded, some of these women began to articulate what they were experiencing. Not attraction precisely, though that was part of it. Not simple admiration, though that too played a role. What they were experiencing was a kind of ideological seduction, a slow revelation that the worldview they had been taught was not merely wrong in its particulars, but fundamentally inverted in its values. They had been taught that privation built character, that suffering ennobled, that the body was something to be mastered and subdued. What they were observing suggested that abundance enabled strength, that well-being enhanced capability, that the body could be celebrated rather than suppressed. The ultimate surrender of Japan in August 1945 brought new waves of prisoners and detainees into American custody, and with them came new opportunities for observation and ideological reassessment. Japanese soldiers, many of whom had fought with suicidal determination rather than accept capture, found themselves in camps where their former enemies provided medical care, adequate food, and treatment that, while far from luxurious, was notably more humane than what Japanese forces had provided to Allied prisoners. The cognitive dissonance experienced by male prisoners has been more thoroughly documented, but the experience of women, already psychologically destabilized by months of detention, took on additional dimensions as the full scope of Japan's defeat became undeniable. In September 1945, a woman named Haruko, who had worked as an administrator at a comfort station in the Philippines, wrote a letter to her family in Osaka. The letter was intercepted and copied by American intelligence, then filed away in archives where it remained largely unnoticed for decades. In it, she struggles to explain what she has experienced. The Americans are not what we were told. I feel I must tell you this, though I do not know if this letter will reach you, and I do not know what you will think of me for writing it. We were told they were demons, but they are only men. We were told they were weak, but they are strong. We were told they would abuse us, but they have treated us with more consideration than I saw our own soldiers treat each other. I do not understand this. I was raised to believe in the superiority of our people, in the divine mission of our empire, in the weakness of the West. But I have seen with my own eyes that this was not true. The soldiers here are healthy and strong and laugh often. They play games like children but fight like warriors. They have so much food they complain about it. I have watched them exercise and train, and their bodies are nothing like what we were shown in the propaganda films. I am ashamed to admit that I have watched them, but I could not help myself. They represent something I do not have words for, a kind of freedom perhaps, or a way of being human that we were taught did not exist or was morally corrupt if it did exist. I do not know what will happen to us. I do not know what Japan will become now that we have lost. But I know that what I believed before was false, and I do not know what to believe instead. This is very frightening. The fear Haruko articulates was not unique to her. As the full scope of Japan's defeat became clear, as the mythology of inevitable Japanese victory revealed itself as delusion, the women who had served in the occupied territories and found themselves in American custody faced not merely the practical question of what would happen to them, but the existential question of how to reconstruct a coherent worldview from the fragments of a discredited ideology. The physical presence of American soldiers, their health, their strength, their casual confidence, remained a constant, undeniable challenge to the old certainties. These women had been taught that spiritual cultivation through privation and discipline was the highest human achievement, that the soft materialism of the West was a kind of moral disease, that Japanese culture represented the pinnacle of human civilization. Yet here they were, defeated, occupied, dependent for survival on the generosity of an enemy whose soldiers embodied physical abundance and vitality, beyond anything they had ever seen in their own men, even in peacetime. The attraction some of these women felt, an attraction, remains an inadequate word for something so psychologically complex, was inseparable from this larger process of ideological collapse and reconstruction. To admit attraction was to admit that the entire framework of values they had been raised with was inverted or false. If American bodies, built by abundance and unsuppressed by excessive discipline, were more vital and powerful than Japanese bodies worn down by privation framed as virtue, then what did that say about the value system that had celebrated that privation? If strength came from being well-fed rather than from spiritual transcendence of hunger, if physical confidence was not incompatible with moral decency, if abundance could coexist with discipline and effectiveness, then what had all the sacrifice been for? The psychological mechanism at work here is complex and not fully captured by simple concepts like Stockholm Syndrome or collaborationism. What these women were experiencing was a forced confrontation with evidence that systematically contradicted their prior beliefs, conducted under conditions where physical and emotional vulnerability made psychological defenses difficult to maintain. The attraction to American soldiers, both as individuals and as symbols, was bound up with a desperate need to find new frameworks of meaning in the wreckage of the old. Some women resolved this dissonance by rejecting their previous ideology entirely, embracing with almost religious fervor the idea that American culture represented a superior form of human organization. Others tried to maintain some synthesis, arguing that Japan had been led astray by militarism, but that core Japanese values remained superior. Still others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to articulate what they had experienced, carrying the confusion and pain of ideological collapse as a private burden. But for many, the memory of those volleyball games, of young American soldiers moving with unself-conscious vitality in the tropical heat, became a kind of pivot point, a concrete image around which larger questions of meaning and value could coalesce. Decades later, In oral histories collected by researchers studying the Japanese experience of defeat and occupation, some of these women would still mention those observations: the shock of physical abundance, the disorienting recognition that everything they had been taught was wrong. One woman, interviewed in 1987 when she was in her 70s, spoke about watching American soldiers play volleyball in a detention camp in Guam. She had been 23 at the time, a nurse who had volunteered for service out of patriotic duty. "I remember thinking," she said, "that if our ideology was correct, those men should not exist. They should have been weak and fearful and corrupted by their easy lives, but they were none of those things. They were young and strong, and they laughed easily, and they moved with such confidence. And I remember feeling angry, angry that I had been lied to, angry that we had sacrificed so much for a lie, angry that these enemy soldiers seemed more vital and alive than our own men who were dying for a false god. But also," she paused, searching for words, "also feeling something like admiration or envy or desire. Not sexual desire, or not only that, though I am too old now to be ashamed of admitting there was some of that too, but desire for what they represented, a different way of being human, a world where abundance was not shameful, where the body was not something to be punished and transcended, where strength came from being nourished rather than from learning to endure starvation. I wanted that, and that wanting felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught to value." This testimony, preserved in an academic archive that few have consulted, captures something essential about the experience of these women. They were caught between worlds, between the collapsing mythology of Japanese supremacy and the emerging reality of American power, between the ascetic values of their upbringing and the abundant vitality of the victors. The attraction they felt was not simply personal but ideological, a gravitational pull toward a different conception of what it meant to be human, to be strong, to be free. The epilogue to this story is scattered across decades and continents, as fragmentary as the historical record itself. Some of these women returned to Japan after the war and tried to reintegrate into a society that was itself undergoing radical transformation under American occupation. They carried with them memories and observations that they often could not speak about: the experience of having watched the American soldiers, of having felt things they were not supposed to feel, of having had their worldview shattered not by bombs or speeches, but by the simple, overwhelming fact of physical presence. A few formed relationships with American soldiers in the months and years following the war, marriages that were often controversial and required the women to leave Japan entirely, to emigrate to America and try to build lives in a culture they knew only through the distorted lenses of propaganda and the fragmentary observations of detention camps. These relationships were complicated by all the usual difficulties of intercultural marriage, but also by the specific burden of history, the weight of having been on opposite sides of a brutal war, the memory of ideologies that had framed each other as subhuman, the task of building intimacy across chasms of language and experience. But for most, the impact was more subtle and internal, a permanent alteration in worldview that could never be fully articulated or resolved. They had seen something that contradicted everything they had been taught, and that seeing could not be unseen. They had experienced attraction, physical, ideological, existential, to men who represented the complete inversion of their culture's values, and that attraction had revealed that their culture's values were not inevitable or absolute but contingent, and in crucial ways false. The volleyball games, of course, were incidental. They mattered only because they provided a concrete, repeated opportunity for observation, a daily reminder of physical realities that ideology could not explain away. Another symbol would have served equally well: the food, the medical care, the casual friendliness. What mattered was not the specific image, but what it represented: abundance as strength, vitality as virtue, freedom as compatible with discipline, the body as something to be celebrated rather than suppressed. In the larger arc of history, These individual experiences of ideological disillusionment contributed to the broader transformation of post-war Japan. The mythology of Japanese supremacy could not survive the overwhelming evidence of American power and abundance. The occupation, for all its complexities and problems, introduced democratic values and material prosperity that gradually reshaped Japanese society. The women who had served in the occupied territories and experienced detention by American forces were part of this transformation, carrying within them the seeds of doubt about the old order and grudging, complicated admiration for aspects of the new. But the human dimension of this history, the psychological vertigo of ideological collapse, the guilty fascination with enemy bodies, the slow erosion of certainty under the pressure of undeniable evidence, remains largely untold. It does not fit comfortably into narratives of either heroic resistance or grateful liberation. It is too ambiguous, too psychologically complex, too bound up with uncomfortable questions about desire and ideology and the malleability of human belief. On a humid evening in February 1945, in a detention camp in the Philippines, a group of Japanese women sat beneath a canvas tarp and watched American soldiers play volleyball. They watched the ball arc through the air, watched the men jump and dive and laugh, watched the way muscles move beneath sun-darkened skin, watched with a complicated mixture of fear and fascination, and something they could not name. They had been taught that these men were demons, weak and cruel and corrupt. What they saw contradicted everything they believed. And in that contradiction, in the space between what they had been taught and what they could not help but see, something shifted, not all at once, not completely, but enough to make the old certainties impossible to maintain. This is what ideology collision looks like in its most intimate form. Not the clash of armies or the rhetoric of leaders, but the quiet disintegration of belief in the face of embodied evidence. The women watching those volleyball games were experiencing the dissolution of a worldview, the revelation that spiritual superiority through privation was a mythology that could not survive contact with the material abundance and physical vitality it claimed to transcend. They were seeing, perhaps for the first time, that strength could come from being well-fed, that confidence could coexist with decency, that abundance was not incompatible with discipline or moral virtue. And they were feeling, though they could not have articulated it in these terms, the first stirrings of a different possibility, a different way of understanding what it meant to be human in the world. Not the ascetic ideal of their upbringing, with its emphasis on endurance and submission and the suppression of physical need, but something more generous, more vital, more celebratory of the body and its capacities. They were feeling, against everything they had been taught, the pull of American abundance not as decadence but as a different kind of strength, one that enabled rather than required transcendence of material need. This recognition did not come all at once, and it did not come without profound psychological cost. These women had built their identities on the foundation of beliefs that were now revealed as false. The attraction they felt, to the soldiers, to what the soldiers represented, to the possibility of a world structured by different values, was inseparable from the pain of losing the certainties that had given their lives meaning. They were attracted not despite the ideological collision, but because of it, drawn toward a new framework of meaning, even as the old one crumbled around them. Years later, decades later, some of these women would try to explain what they had felt in those months of detention, watching enemy soldiers play meaningless games in the tropical heat. They would struggle to find words for the complexity of it, the shame and fascination and anger and desire all tangled together, the sense that they were witnessing not merely a military defeat, but the collapse of an entire way of understanding the world. And at the center of it all, that recurring image, young men moving with confident vitality, their bodies testament to a system of abundance that had seemed impossible, immoral, unvirtuous, but that had proven stronger than all the spiritual discipline and sacrificial devotion Japan could muster. This is the story that history does not tell, or tells only in fragments and whispers. not the story of nations at war, but of individuals caught between worldviews, forced by circumstance to confront evidence that everything they believed was wrong. It is the story of women who found themselves unexpectedly attracted to enemy soldiers, not simply as men, but as symbols of a different possibility for human existence. It is the story of ideology's power and its fragility, of how completely a worldview can structure perception, and how quickly it can dissolve when confronted with systematic contradiction. And it is, finally, a story about freedom, not the abstract political freedom of democratic institutions, but the more fundamental freedom that comes from recognizing that,